As we meet for this symposium, I think that this is a very dramatic time in the environmental justice movement, because in a relatively short period of time, although this is something that began decades ago, in the last couple of years, the profile of this issue has ramped up exponentially. Literally at the highest levels of our government, environmental justice is declared to be a top priority.
I work a lot with community organizations on issues related to toxic chemical contamination, pollution prevention, and especially incineration and other dirty industries. And one phenomenon that's basically a buzzword that's come up again and again in most recent times is this issue of environmental racism.
Much of the pollution and toxic waste business in Southeast Chicago has been institutionalized racism. What that means is you target those communities from which you're likely to get the least political flack, the least vocal rhetoric, and that, of course, are the black communities in Southeast Chicago and the low-income white communities. The real low-income working class.
These are areas that are not canvassed by environmental groups, are not served by the political powers that be, and are certainly served by the toxic industries. But so you have really multiple factors that lead to pollution following the path of least resistance, which means that it's in the backyard of minority communities across the country. It's on Native American reservations across the country, and this is becoming an escalating problem that we all must address.
Industry should be concerned about environmental justice because the problem is real. We know, for instance, that for poor families, 68% of black children suffer from lead poisoning versus something like 36% of whites. That's a disparity of 2 to 1 between black and white, but those numbers, both numbers are too high, but that number for black children is scandalously high. 68% of black kids suffer the mental impairment and the other physical side effects of lead poisoning.
Environmental racism has a number of facets. Some of them have to do with people of color. It's also a consideration of low income. The bottom line, though, is political powerlessness for whatever reason at a given moment in time.
I think there is more to the environmental justice issue than merely a determination of was there overt discriminatory intent in the location of certain pollution-generating facilities. I think there is another very legitimate question, which is, are there groups of people, in this case minorities or poor people, who are bearing a disproportionate impact or burden associated with decisions that were made in the past, whether they are intentionally discriminatory or not? That's a very valid question.
Environmental justice is a more important term even than environmental racism. Environmental racism is a part of environmental justice, but only a part.
I would say it started back in the early 80s. For instance, in North Carolina, there was an action where 500 people got arrested, including Reverend Ben Chavis and the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they forced the congressman from that area to get the GAO to do a study that concluded that 3 out of 4 counties surrounding this proposed PCB dump that they were trying to stop were principally African American. And this was no surprise to the people there, but it was the first time that the powers that be were beginning to acknowledge the phenomenon of environmental racism.
There always has been a dual standard in the enforcement of law. The National Law Journal has proven this in their nationwide study of all the Superfund cases in which they find that communities of color get a much slower response from the officials, the EPA, etc., regarding seriously hazardous sites in their communities. It takes much longer for the government, the EPA, to acknowledge that these areas are highly toxic, and then it takes an even longer period of time compared to white areas to basically go about remediation, about cleanup.
The Commission for Racial Justice in 1987 covered in their report Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. Its findings were that race was the most statistically significant correlator between demographics and where you're going to find waste disposal facilities. And it has been widely circulated, often cited, often referred to And it's been a very important piece of study. It probably more than any one single thing has helped to raise the issue of environmental justice to the level that it is today, which is a very high level of attention and hopefully action.
Is it possible to remove the question of race or ethnicity and simply substitute economic status? In other words, if instead of looking at the issue as an issue that is affecting minority communities, is it instead an issue that's affecting poor communities? The studies by the Church of Christ and others have insisted that no, it's not economic solely, that it may be a factor, but the deciding factor in their view is that it's because of the racial makeup of the community.
But Reverend Chavis, in his capacity with the Racial Commission for Justice out of the United Church of Christ, did a report with a lot of sound methodology examining the phenomenon of citing of toxic waste, commercial hazardous waste facilities, both commercial facilities and fly dumps, illegal facilities that were created out of neglect. And in both categories, they found that there was a strong correlation between the citing of these facilities and a high percentage of ethnic or racial population.